Republican Congresswoman Nancy Mace posted something on social media, a video of her in an interview that caused a lot of people to respond, rightfully so, and call her out for her dishonesty in this clip. Now, even though it's very aggravating what Nancy Mace is going to say here in just a second, it's also a good opportunity for me to talk/rant about something that has been on my mind and bothering me a lot as of recently. Even people in my personal life can attest to the fact that this subject has been coming up rather often. So here is, again, MAGA Republican Congresswoman Nancy Mace. As I said before, one of the most dishonest people in Congress. She tries to pretend to be moderate in certain settings, then she uses that moderate credibility to go around and be very extreme and dishonest. With that being said, here's what she posted.
You're seeing, since Joe Biden took office, crime skyrocket all around the country. And especially in big cities, you see illegal immigrants coming in, beating up our cops and being taken out without bail, let out of jail without bail, giving the middle finger to America and our men and women in blue and in uniform. You're seeing crime skyrocket.
I'm going to really quickly pause your viewing of this video to ask you to subscribe to the YouTube channel. Just click that subscribe button plus the like button as well and the alert bell so you get notifications. Back to it.
You're seeing fentanyl cases skyrocket. We're literally allowing China to import deadly drugs like fentanyl into this country, and it's killing our children and killing our citizens. We're allowing Joe Biden to have the cartel sneak drugs into the country, smuggle people into the country illegally. Like, it's just okay to do that under Joe Biden. It's not okay. We're a nation of laws and should follow them.
Okay, so she said a lot there. And of course, it started with her saying that crime is skyrocketing under Joe Biden. We'll address the other things she said in just a second. But friend of the show, Aaron Rupar, said, Nancy, I noticed you didn't cite a single statistic in your little video. That's because you're a liar. Harry Sisson, also friend of the show, said, FBI data says crime has plummeted under Joe Biden. Nancy Mace is a liar. I pointed out that we are hitting near 50-year lows in violent crime, and you could just go on and on, person after person calling her out for this. Will it make a difference? No, but we're going to talk about the facts here so that you have them and can cite them to people making similar claims. Before getting to the specific crime data that people are referring to in fact-checking Nancy Mace, I do have to address her fear-mongering about the border. If she wanted to address, for example, fentanyl coming across the southern border, she'd do so by supporting the Biden-supported legislation, the bipartisan border deal. I've talked about this in the past, but as one example of a thing that's not being done because this legislation is being obstructed by MAGA Republicans like Nancy Mace because of Trump asking them to, there are state-of-the-art fentanyl scanners that are at the southern border, ready to go, but can't be installed because you need extra resources to make that happen and get these things up and running. And so they're just sitting, collecting dust. And we could be catching more fentanyl coming through legal ports of entry, which of course is where fentanyl primarily gets across, contrary to much of the narratives from people like Nancy Mace. And we could be catching people trying to smuggle it into the country, but instead we're not, with some portion of people, because these scanners haven't been installed, because this legislation was not passed, because Donald Trump asked MAGA Republicans like Nancy Mace to obstruct it. Why? Because he wanted to run on the border. He likes the idea of exacerbating problems at the border so that he can fearmonger about them instead of just addressing problems that exist. So wrong on both fronts there from Nancy Mace. But let's look at a couple different visuals here when it comes to crime. And last thing I'll say before doing that, none of this is to, as I often say, invalidate your own experiences with crime, as I say with the economy too, or pretend like there aren't still problems with crime. Of course there are. We're just looking at the data, zooming out nationwide, and trying to understand this within the context of a broader timeline. So here are a couple visuals to start with. The violent crime right now, again, as I mentioned, is near 50-year lows and is lower than it was any time under Donald Trump. So if they're saying crime's out of control right now under Joe Biden, they're saying it was even more out of control under Donald Trump, which, yes, in 2020, there was a huge spike under Donald Trump because of the pandemic. But even the years before that, crime was higher, or violent crime was, than it is currently under Joe Biden. And if you look at property crime, also historically low under Joe Biden. And then we'll move on to a visual that shows you this a little bit more clearly progressing over time, and the story of Joe Biden's presidency, as you're seeing here with violent crime, is a sharp decrease. And we've actually seen one of the most sharp plummets in crime in history in the United States under Joe Biden. And so is some of that because there was this spike that the pandemic caused because of all the conditions that the pandemic sent into motion, and that naturally was going to come down no matter what? Of course. But then for us to get even lower than we were in violent crime before this crisis is remarkable. And so we want to keep making progress. But if you're reasonable, logical, and consistent, and you were previously blaming Biden for any crimes, or you were saying the spike that happened as he was coming into office, that started before he got in office, but if you were blaming that crime spike on him, wouldn't you give him credit now? But no, many people don't. And then property crime too, as I said, historically low and on the decline, which is really good to see. Before I discuss this further, here is Steve Ratner on MSNBC.
Crime is actually continuing to drop under President Biden. So let's take a look at violent crime. This is per 100,000 people in relationship to our size of our population. And you can see that violent crime actually since 2020 has dropped by 15%. 339 violent crimes per 100,000 people. It's below any place it was during the Trump administration, and it's had this huge drop in 2023. The same is basically true of property crime. You can see here, this is people robbing homes and things of that like. Down 7%, 1,830 per 100,000 people. So this is a complete fiction that crime is up under the Biden administration.
Now, interestingly, Nancy Mace does specifically represent South Carolina. She's a congresswoman from there. And as ABC News reports, according to a Forbes magazine study released this month on the most dangerous states in America, South Carolina ranks 8th with a crime rate of 4.91 violent crimes per every 1,000 residents. But instead of trying to do a little introspection and understand why maybe her red state has a bigger problem with crime than many blue states, and obviously not accepting much of the data nationwide that shows Biden's policies clearly are doing something right, she will spend her time fear-mongering about either non-existent crime numbers or crime in New York City or something. And we've talked about similar fear-mongering from Jim Jordan, for example, and then you look in the data, oh wait, Jim Jordan's district is statistically more dangerous than New York City, or Tommy Tuberville. That example we went over a couple times in the past, saying New York City is so unsafe, and then you see that Alabama has a homicide rate 3 times that of New York City, and he doesn't seem to be fear-mongering about his own state. And again, wondering why so often these problems are disproportionately bad in red states with governments governing the way that Tuberville, Nancy Mace, Jim Jordan, and others would say is effective, but clearly not. And before I say more, here is Ron DeSantis pushing these same sorts of ideas.
They get no support from these Democrat politicians. It used to be police officers, a lot of them were Democrats. That's changed. The Democratic Party has turned their back on law enforcement. They embrace the criminal element and let the inmates run the asylum and a lot of these people. And, you know, Obama and Biden and Clinton can go raise $25 million because they're in the upper echelon. So they're immune from their own policies. The people that it really hurts are the people who are more working class and middle income Americans. Democratic Party has turned their back on them. They're really become the party of the elite.
Yeah, so I do want to specify something, by the way. I know my tone is very level-headed right now. I want you to know that inside, it's a different story. My tone is not matching how I really feel about the subject, but I know that you don't want to be screamed at all the time. So I'm keeping myself moderated in the way that I'm speaking about this. But no, this drives me crazy, because how do we engage in a rational political conversation if one person in that conversation or one side gets to just make things up and just ignore the data and just sort of tell the story they want to tell regardless of its connection to reality. How do we engage with that? Because if DeSantis were honest, if Nancy Mace were honest, they would be studying, I tell you, Joe's policies, and they would be trying to figure out how on earth is he overseeing such a successful plummet in crime. I'm smiling because it's such a complicated subject, what contributes to crime. And I do think part of it has to do with the strong recovery based in part on Biden and Democrats' recovery efforts and policies. And that absolutely has mattered and impacted the broad crime situation across the country. But also you have great work being done by local governments and broader long-term trends and all these things that relate to it. So I'm not actually believing it's all because of Joe Biden, but if they're going to pretend like anything that happens wrong is Joe Biden's fault, then they would act like things that are right, if they were consistent and honest, are because of him as well. But instead, again, they're living in this alternate universe. And so then how do we talk about what to do about the crime that still does exist, right? If you're saying you reject crime statistics and you reject the very entity's documentation of these statistics that you used to point to under Trump when you would try to give him credit for things, then how do we make sense of anything crime-wise? And that gets to why this is such a successful sort of propaganda effort by the right, which is that crime is one of the most effective fear-mongering tools. And so because there's always been crime, you can always find anecdotal evidence of that crime, right? And a lot of people have had some experience or heard of an experience or something with crime. And so then you can pull on those heartstrings, and then it's just about directing them in the direction you want them to go for networks like Fox News or Eric Bolling here. So you fearmonger, you sort of rev someone up about real frightening situations that still do happen, but then you tell them that means something's happening that's not, a crime surge. And you tell them that means that Biden's policies aren't working, when it's the opposite. If we want to minimize these frightening situations, again, that do exist, then presumably based on the trends, the data we're looking at here, we would want more of Biden's governance. And that's something they can't contend with. And it's very similar to the economy. I'll try not to get into that because I'm going to be talking more about that in a different segment today. But you can, if you're dishonest enough, as we're seeing, tell an alternate universe version of the story and then convince people to vote against their interests, against the leaders that will actually end up implementing policies that benefit their lives the most. And that's really sad at the end of the day. It really is. Because people will continue going in passionately voting for people who are going to make their lives worse if they get into power. So my request to all of you is get super clear on these facts, some of which we've gone over in this segment, some of which we've gone over in other segments. And when you can, when socially appropriate, I'm not trying to make you get in some big family argument, my goodness. But if it makes sense, inform people on this. Because we're in a really broken situation, clearly, politically, when it comes to how people are getting their information, where Biden can oversee one of the most stunning economic recoveries in history. And we can do better than our counterparts economically in that recovery. And he can oversee this long list of legislative achievements that are historic and can have an actual policy agenda for what would come next, because there's still a lot of problems we got to keep working, and can oversee this huge plummet in crime. And on all those issues, a massive portion of the country can think the opposite about Biden's record. Clearly, someone's messing up in the media ecosystem. Some people purposefully doing things wrong, some people accidentally. And people are just not getting informed as they should about this accurate information. And so it's going to have to be our job to do just that. Make sure you are subscribed to this YouTube channel.